I am Harrison Blake, 70 years old, and somehow still processing the betrayal my own flesh and blood inflicted on me. As the founder of a commercial real estate empire, I gave them everything, but I always maintained my boundaries. Last month, on my 70th birthday, I called my son to grab a simple dinner. He claimed he was drowning in work. Between sips of my solitary bourbon at the city's most exclusive steakhouse, I looked across the dining room and saw him. He was laughing, toasting champagne with his wife and her mother. They thought I was just a clueless old man waiting to die. I simply walked over and snapped his corporate credit card in half right on their table. That night I logged into my secure servers, locked down my assets, and initiated a plan that would leave them with $15 million in toxic federal debt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The ringing of the phone echoed in my quiet, empty office. It was 6 in the evening on a Tuesday. Not just any Tuesday. It was my 70th birthday. I sat behind my heavy mahogany desk at Blake Holdings, looking out over the city skyline I had spent 4 decades helping to build. I picked up the receiver and dialed my son Derek. He was 36 years old, my vice president, and the only family I really had left. The line trilled 3 times before he finally picked up. I could hear a faint shuffling of papers in the background, a very deliberate sound of someone pretending to be incredibly busy. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice light. "I know it is late, but I was thinking we could head down to the Prime Steakhouse on 5th Avenue. Grab a ribeye, maybe a decent bottle of scotch. It is my 70th after all." A heavy, exaggerated sigh came through the receiver. It was the kind of sigh a teenager gives when asked to clean their room, not the sigh of a grown man speaking to his father. "Dad, I am so sorry," Derek said. His voice dripped with manufactured exhaustion. "I am absolutely buried here. The city planning office just kicked back the zoning permits for the new West Side commercial lot. I am going to be stuck at my desk, staring at blueprints and legal files until midnight. I cannot leave the office right now." I leaned back in my leather chair. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a quiet disappointment that only a parent can truly understand. But I also felt a surge of misguided pride. I had built this real estate empire from absolute scratch. In the 1980s, I slept in the cab of my rusted pickup truck for 3 years, eating cold canned beans, pouring concrete by day, and studying local property laws by night with a flashlight. I built Blake Holdings so my son would never have to know what hunger felt like. If he was working late to protect our legacy, I could not fault him for it. "I understand, son," I replied smoothly, swallowing my disappointment. "The business comes first. We have to keep those permits moving. Do not burn yourself out. We will celebrate next week." "Thanks, Dad. You are the best. I will make it up to you, I promise. Happy birthday." The line went dead. I sat in the silence of my office for a long time. 70 years old. It is a strange milestone. You expect to be surrounded by noise, by family, by a testament to the life you have lived. Instead, I had the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sirens of the city below. I decided I was not going to eat a frozen dinner on my 70th birthday. I put on my overcoat, took the private elevator down to the parking garage, and got into my car. As I drove through the bustling downtown streets, I thought about Derek's childhood. I remembered missing his Little League baseball games because I was negotiating bank loans to keep our company afloat. I remembered the guilt that ate at me every time I had to travel for business. I overcompensated, I knew that now. I gave him the brand new cars, the debt-free college education, the immediate executive title at my firm. I wanted to be the generous father, the man who provided a seamless, frictionless life. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I had insulated him from the real world. I had denied him the struggle that builds character. And the result was a 36-year-old man who could effortlessly lie to his father on his birthday. The valet took my keys with a respectful nod when I arrived at the steakhouse. It was a place where everybody knew my name, a place where I had closed million-dollar deals over dry, aged steaks. I walked through the heavy glass doors into the warm, dimly lit restaurant. The smell of roasted garlic, seared meat, and expensive red wine filled the air. Soft jazz played over the speakers, blending perfectly with the low murmur of wealthy patrons enjoying their evening. The maitre d' approached me immediately, a warm professional smile on his face. "Mr. Blake, a very happy birthday to you, sir. Will you be joining the rest of your party?" I frowned, stopping in my tracks. "My party?" "Yes, sir," he said, gesturing toward the back of the dining room. "Your son arrived about 30 minutes ago with his guests. We put them at the center VIP booth just as he requested." A cold chill washed over my entire body. It was not the chill of the evening air. It was the sudden sharp drop in temperature that happens when your reality fractures. I did not ask the maitre d' to lead the way. I simply nodded and walked slowly through the dining room. Every step felt heavier than the last. I navigated around waiters carrying silver trays and tables filled with laughing couples. As I neared the center of the room, I heard it. A loud, booming laugh. It was Derek. I stopped behind a large, decorative pillar and looked toward the VIP booth. My son was not buried under zoning permits. He was not staring at blueprints. He was sitting in a plush leather booth, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. Sitting right beside him was his wife, Monica. She was leaning against his shoulder, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. And sitting across from them, demanding the attention of the entire table, was Patricia, Monica's mother. Patricia was a woman who always wore too much perfume and acted like old money, despite never having worked a day in her life. They were feasting. 3 massive seafood towers sat in the center of the table, piled high with fresh oysters, lobster tails, and king crab. 2 open bottles of champagne chilled in silver buckets beside them. I watched Patricia meticulously pick a lobster claw clean. I had never liked Patricia. From the moment Derek married Monica, Patricia had treated my wealth as her own personal lottery winning. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about how tight I was with my assets, hinting that a good father would buy his son a bigger mansion or fund his mother-in-law's European vacations. I always ignored her, choosing family peace over petty squabbles. But seeing her here laughing with a mouthful of food made my blood boil. Monica, too, revealed a side of herself I had never seen. In my presence, she played the demure, respectful daughter-in-law. Now leaning against Derek, her eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely dismissive. I stood in the shadows, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the lie. My son had looked at his phone, seen it was his father calling on his 70th birthday, and chose to lie through his teeth so he could drink champagne with his mother-in-law. "Oh, Derek, you are too good to us," I heard Patricia say loudly, her voice cutting through the jazz music. "This place is magnificent, and on a Tuesday no less. Only the best for my girls," Derek replied smoothly, raising his glass to clink against theirs. "We deserve a break. The office has been exhausting." Monica giggled, sipping her drink. "Are you sure your dad is not going to notice you slipped away? You know how obsessive he gets about his precious schedules." I held my breath, waiting for my son to defend me, waiting for him to show a shred of respect for the man who paid for the suit on his back and the roof over his head. Derek just scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Please, my dad is a clueless old man. He is so focused on his golf swing and his retirement plans that he has no idea what happens outside his own office anymore." He swallowed the excuse about the zoning permits without a second thought. He is completely out of the loop. The 3 of them burst into laughter. It was a cruel, mocking sound that hit me harder than a physical blow. I did not feel sadness in that moment. The hollow ache in my chest vanished, replaced instantly by a burning, razor-sharp clarity. I had spent 40 years dealing with corporate sharks, backstabbers, and hostile takeovers. I knew what a predator looked like. But I never expected to find 3 of them sitting at a dinner table feeding off my money and laughing at my expense. I did not turn around. I did not go home to cry. I stepped out from behind the pillar and began walking directly toward their table. The soft jazz continued to play, but the only thing I could hear was the rhythmic thud of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. They were about to learn that this clueless old man was the one who built the cage they were sitting in. I took my first step away from the shadows. The soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers of the steakhouse seemed to fade into the background, replaced entirely by the steady, measured sound of my own leather shoes striking the polished hardwood floor. I did not rush. A man who has spent 40 years navigating the treacherous waters of commercial real estate knows the value of pacing. You never run toward a crisis. You walk toward it owning every single inch of the space you occupy. As I approached the center VIP booth, the trio remained entirely oblivious to my presence. Patricia was holding court, waving a silver oyster fork in the air, as she told a story, her manicured fingers adorned with diamonds that my son's salary had undoubtedly paid for. Monica was laughing, tossing her head back, her perfect hair catching the dim ambient light. And Derek, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had carried on my shoulders and built an empire for, sat there with a smug, relaxed grin on his face, pouring another glass of vintage champagne for his mother-in-law. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the edge of their table. I just stood there, letting my shadow fall across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Derek was the first to notice. The smile froze on his face, his eyes widening, as if he had just seen a ghost materialize from the floorboards. The crystal champagne flute in his hand tipped slightly, spilling a few drops of the expensive golden liquid onto his cuff. He choked on his breath. Monica followed his gaze. Her laughter cut off so abruptly, it sounded like she had been gagged. She stiffened, pressing her back against the leather booth, her eyes darting between me and her husband in absolute panic. Patricia was the last to realize the party was over. She lowered her oyster fork, her mouth still half open, the arrogant glint in her eyes instantly replaced by a wide-eyed stare. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody spoke. The surrounding tables continued their lively conversations, completely unaware of the silent storm that had just descended upon this booth. "Dad," Derek finally managed to whisper. His voice was incredibly small, entirely stripped of the bravado he had displayed just moments earlier. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "What are you doing here?" "It is my 70th birthday, Derek," I said, my voice steady, calm, and completely devoid of warmth. "I decided to treat myself to a good steak. Since you told me you were buried under a mountain of zoning permits at the office, I figured I would be eating alone." Imagine my surprise to find my hard-working vice president right here in the middle of the dining room. The lie tumbled out of his mouth before he could even think to stop it. It was the desperate, frantic lie of a cornered man. "Dad, wait, it is not what it looks like. We are entertaining a client. Patricia has a friend who is a major architectural consultant. She is just helping me pitch some preliminary design ideas for the new West Side commercial lot. I was going to present the entire portfolio to you tomorrow morning. I swear, we are working." I looked at the table. There were no blueprints. There were no legal pads. There were no architectural sketches. There was only a towering structure of cracked crab legs, empty lobster shells, and half-eaten caviar. "Working," I repeated softly. Monica tried to intervene, her voice artificially sweet, attempting to salvage the unsalvageable. "Harrison, please, we really did not want to bother you on your special day. Derek was just trying to handle the heavy lifting so you could relax. Why do you not pull up a chair? Let us buy you a drink to celebrate." I ignored her entirely. My eyes had found the only piece of paper on the entire table. Resting on a small silver tray right next to Patricia's plate was the itemized bill. Even from 2 feet away, the bold numbers at the bottom of the receipt were impossible to miss. $3,500. And sitting squarely on top of that receipt, catching the dim light of the chandelier, was a heavy matte black metal card, the Blake Holdings corporate credit card. My chest tightened, but not from sadness. It was a visceral, deeply rooted anger that pulled me backward through time. I stared at that black metal card, and suddenly I was not in a luxury steakhouse anymore. I was 32 years old again. It was a freezing November night in 1984. I was sleeping in the cab of a beaten-up Ford pickup truck parked on a muddy construction site because I could not afford to pay rent and meet payroll for my 3 laborers. I remembered waking up shivering, my hands cracked and bleeding from mixing concrete in the biting cold. I remembered washing my face in the icy water of a gas station sink before walking into bank after bank, begging loan officers to take a chance on my first commercial project. I remembered missing meals, missing sleep, missing the simple comforts of life, pouring every ounce of my sweat, blood, and soul into building the foundation of a company that would bear my name. I endured a decade of grueling, back-breaking poverty so that the name Blake Holdings would mean something, so that it would command respect, so that my family would never have to shiver in the dark. And now my son was using the fruit of my lifelong agony to buy $3,000 seafood towers for a woman who despised me while laughing about how clueless and old I was. I reached out slowly. Neither Derek nor Monica dared to move a muscle. Patricia sat perfectly still, her breath hitched in her throat. I picked up the heavy black corporate credit card from the silver tray. The cold metal felt weighty in my palm. I looked Derek directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet authority of a man who knows exactly what he has built is far more terrifying than any shouting match. "Dad," Derek pleaded, his voice trembling slightly. "Please, let us go outside and talk about this. People are starting to stare." He was right. The unnatural tension at our table had begun to attract the attentions of the surrounding patrons. Conversations nearby had hushed, and curious eyes were drifting our way. "You should have been reviewing zoning permits, son," I said softly, gripping the edges of the metal card with both hands. "You should have been protecting the legacy I handed you on a silver platter." I applied pressure. The heavy titanium card resisted for a fraction of a second before it gave way. With a sharp, loud crack, the metal snapped cleanly in half. Monica gasped. Derek flinched backward. Patricia looked pale. I tossed the broken pieces directly onto Patricia's plate. "Happy birthday to me," I said. "Pay for it yourself, son." I turned and walked out, leaving them. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the heavy doors of the steakhouse closing behind me. The drive back to my estate was a blur of neon city lights and dark asphalt. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan so tightly that my knuckles physically ached, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the cold realization settling deep into my bones. The rush of adrenaline from the restaurant was already fading, leaving behind a chilling, absolute clarity. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my property, the gravel crunching under my tires, and parked in front of the sprawling stone mansion. The house was entirely dark. It was a monument to success, a fortress I had built to protect my family from the harsh realities of the world. Tonight it just felt incredibly hollow. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. My footsteps echoed against the marble tiles. I did not turn on the main lights. I walked directly into my private study and closed the heavy oak door behind me. I walked over to the mahogany bar cart, picked up a crystal decanter, and poured myself 2 fingers of neat bourbon. I held the glass up to the moonlight filtering through the window, but I did not take a sip. My mind was racing, analyzing every micro-expression I had just witnessed at that dinner table. Derek had not just lied to me. He had lied with the practiced, seamless ease of a man who had done it 100 times before. The shock of snapping that corporate credit card was wearing off, and the analytical side of my brain, the side that had ruthlessly evaluated commercial real estate acquisitions for 4 decades, completely took over. I sat down in my wingback chair and set the bourbon on the desk. This was not about a missed birthday. It was not even about the $3,500 spent on fresh oysters and vintage champagne. Those were just symptoms. The real disease was the staggering entitlement I had seen in their eyes. Patricia had been gorging herself on my dime, completely unfazed, treating my son like her own personal bank account. And Monica had mocked me, She had giggled while Derek called me a clueless old man who was too obsessed with golf to notice what was happening in his own company. That was the specific piece of the puzzle that made my stomach twist into a hard, unforgiving knot. Derek believed I was entirely blind. He genuinely believed that because I had stepped back to let him handle the daily operations of Blake Holdings, I had lost my edge. If he felt comfortable enough to casually swipe a high-limit corporate card for a lavish family dinner, knowing the accounting department processed those receipts every single Friday, it meant he was no longer afraid of oversight. It meant he had circumvented the oversight entirely. A man does not start by stealing thousands of dollars in front of an audience. He starts small. He tests the fences. Only when he is certain the security alarms are disconnected does he grow bold enough to throw a feast in the middle of the city. I looked around my study at the framed blueprints of my first commercial high-rise, at the worn yellow hard hat I kept on a shelf as a reminder of exactly where I came from. I had spent 40 years ensuring that no external force could ever steal a single brick from my empire. Now the thief had the keys to the front door. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat in the dark, watching the shadows stretch and shift across the Persian rug as the early morning hours ticked by. I traced the lineage of my son's recent behavior. The sudden, unannounced meetings with contractors I had never vetted. The times I had asked to review the quarterly expenditure reports, only for Derek to brush me off, claiming he was still consolidating the numbers for a cleaner presentation. I had blindly given him the benefit of the doubt. I had allowed the pride of a father to completely override the survival instincts of a chief executive. I had trained him to manage vast properties, negotiate complex leases, and oversee massive construction budgets. I had handed him immense financial power, assuming his moral compass was as sturdy as the steel beams holding up our corporate buildings. That assumption was the greatest liability of my entire career. By the time the first rays of morning light breached the horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and gray, my parental grief had completely burned away. What remained was a singular, unbreakable resolve. I stood up, my joints stiff from the long night, and walked over to my desk. I picked up my phone and checked the time. It was exactly 6 in the morning. Too early for most of the corporate world, but not for the man I desperately needed to call. I dialed the direct cell phone number of Gregory Pierce. Gregory was the senior corporate attorney for Blake Holdings. He was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who had stood faithfully by my side during the most vicious corporate battles of the late 90s. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and immediately alert. He knew that if I was calling him before dawn, the sky was falling. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him exactly what had happened at the restaurant. I described the forged excuse, the champagne, the mockery, and the severed corporate card. Gregory listened in absolute silence. When I finished my recounting, he let out a slow, measured breath. I told him that I needed a complete, unvarnished picture of my son's financial footprint within the company. I instructed Gregory to bypass the internal accounting department entirely. I wanted a forensic shadow audit conducted on every single transaction Derek had authorized over the last 24 months. I wanted every corporate credit card statement, every vendor invoice he had signed, and every expense report he had submitted, pulled and scrutinized by an external team. Gregory warned me that this kind of internal investigation could trigger alarms if Derek had accomplices in the finance department. I told him to lock down the server access under the guise of a routine security upgrade. Derek was not to know a single thing until I had every piece of paper in my hands. Gregory agreed, his tone turning deadly serious. He promised to have a preliminary report on my desk by noon. I hung up the phone and looked out the glass window. The sprawling city below was just beginning to wake up, the streets filling with people rushing to their daily work. They had no idea that high above them an empire was about to be purged. I slowly poured the bourbon down the heavy brass drain. I did not need expensive alcohol to numb the lingering pain anymore. I needed absolute, unwavering focus. The trap was now firmly, quietly, and permanently set. The morning sun crawled across the polished surface of my desk, casting long, sharp shadows that mirrored the coldness inside my chest. I sat in my office since 6 o'clock waiting for the inevitable performance. Derek arrived at 9:15. He knocked twice, a soft, hesitant sound, before pushing the heavy oak door open. He looked the part, I had to give him that. He was wearing the same suit from the night before, slightly rumpled now, with the collar unbuttoned and his tie loosened. His eyes were carefully hooded, carrying the manufactured weight of a man who had supposedly spent the entire night battling local zoning boards. He walked in carrying 2 cups of black coffee and placed one in front of me. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, the perfect picture of an exhausted son trying to do his best. "Morning, Dad," he said, his voice thick with an incredibly convincing fatigue. "I brought you your favorite roast from that little place down the block. I know I am the last person you probably want to see right now." I looked at the coffee. It was a nice touch. It was the exact kind of prop a guilty conscience uses to buy forgiveness. "Good morning, Derek," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I assume the permits took longer than expected." He dropped into one of the leather guest chairs across from my desk, letting out a long, heavy breath. "Dad, I need to apologize to you. I did not spend the night fighting the city planning office. I lied to you, and I am so deeply sorry." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together over my lap. "Go on." "It was Monica," he said, shaking his head with a look of pure, fabricated despair. "You know how she gets when Patricia comes into town. Her mother is relentless. She demanded we take her out to a nice dinner, and she completely hijacked the evening. I told them it was your 70th birthday. I told them I needed to be with you, but Patricia threw an absolute fit. Monica threatened to take the kids and go stay at a hotel if I did not keep the peace. I was backed into a corner, Dad. I panicked. I knew if I told you the truth, it would just hurt your feelings on your special day. I did not want you to feel second best to my in-laws, so I made up the story about the permits. It was a cowardly thing to do, and I hate myself for it. It was a masterful performance. If I had not stood in the shadows of that steakhouse, if I had not heard him explicitly call me a clueless old man who was completely out of the loop, I would have believed every single word. He painted himself as the tragic peacekeeper, the loving son caught between an unreasonable wife, a demanding mother-in-law, and a father he just wanted to protect. He placed the blame entirely on the women in his life, framing his deception as an act of twisted paternal loyalty. "And the corporate credit card?" I asked softly, letting the question hang in the air. Derek flushed, his eyes darting down to the floor before meeting my gaze again. "That was another mistake. Patricia ordered half the menu before I even sat down. When the bill came, it was outrageous. I panicked again. I did not have that kind of liquidity in my personal checking account at the moment, so I used the company card. I fully intended to reimburse the accounts payable department this morning before anyone even noticed. I swear to you, Dad, it was just a temporary lapse in judgment to get through a horrible evening." I sat there looking at the man I had raised. I saw the calculated remorse in his posture, the desperate hope in his eyes that his old trusting father would just sweep this under the rug like I had always done. He wanted absolution. He wanted the slate wiped clean so he could go back to his comfortable thieving existence. I stood up, walked around my massive mahogany desk, and stood over him. He tensed slightly, unsure of my next move. I placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. "Derek," I said, infusing my voice with a warmth I had to dig deep into my soul to find. "You should have just told me. You are a grown man with a family to manage, and I know how demanding Patricia can be. Marriage is about compromise. If you had to take them out to keep the peace in your home, I understand that. Family dynamics are rarely simple." The relief that washed over his face was immediate and sickening. The tension completely drained from his shoulders. He looked up at me with a grateful, boyish smile, the smile of a predator who realizes the trap has not yet sprung. "Thank you, Dad." He breathed out, visibly relaxing into the chair. "You do not know how much that means to me. I thought you would be furious. I am disappointed you felt you had to lie. I continued playing the role of the benevolent patriarch flawlessly. But we have a business to run, a legacy to protect. Do not let this happen again. Reimburse the accounting department by the end of the week, and we will put this entire incident behind us. We will celebrate my birthday properly this weekend, just the two of us. How does that sound? It sounds perfect, Dad. I promise no more lies. I am going to make you proud. I know you will, son. Now go get cleaned up. We have a board meeting to prepare for, and I need my vice president operating at full capacity. Derek stood up, buttoned his collar, and adjusted his tie. His confidence was completely restored. He walked out of my office with a renewed spring in his step, secure in the delusion that he had successfully manipulated the clueless old man once again. I watched the heavy oak door click shut behind him. My smile vanished instantly. The warmth I had forced into my eyes evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, calculating focus. I walked back to my desk and picked up the cup of coffee he had brought me. I walked over to the nearest potted plant and poured the dark liquid directly into the soil. I would not accept a peace offering purchased with my own stolen money. Exactly 45 seconds after Derek's footsteps faded down the executive hallway, a soft chime echoed from the back of my office. It was the private executive elevator, a direct line from the underground parking garage that only I and a select few trusted individuals had clearance to use. Gregory Pierce stepped into the room. He did not look like a man who had just enjoyed a leisurely morning. His tie was slightly crooked, his jaw was tight, and his eyes carried the grave intensity of a general preparing for war. In his arms, he carried a massive bound stack of bank statements, ledger printouts, and digital transaction logs. The stack was easily 6 inches thick, a mountain of financial data gathered in record time. He walked briskly across the room and dropped the entire pile onto the center of my mahogany desk. The paper hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Good morning, Harrison," Gregory said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "I brought the shadow audit you requested." I looked down at the towering stack of documents. "That was fast, Gregory. Did the internal systems flag anything while you were pulling the data?" "No," he replied, loosening his tie. "I used the backdoor protocols we established last year. Derek and the finance department have absolutely no idea we pulled these records. As far as the system is concerned, these documents were never accessed." "Good. I just finished speaking with him. He fed me a story about an overbearing mother-in-law and a moment of weakness. He thinks the problem is completely resolved." "Let him think that," Gregory said, pulling a chair up to the desk, "because the problem is vastly larger than a single steak dinner. I spent the last 3 hours analyzing his corporate expenditure flow, and what I found is going to make you extremely sick. This is far worse than we could have ever predicted." I took my seat directly across from him. I placed my 2 hands flat on the desk, bracing myself for the harsh reality. "Tell me exactly what my son has been doing behind my back." Gregory opened the thickest folder. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon about to make an incision. He slid a stapled document across the polished mahogany. It was a summary spreadsheet highlighting Derek's personal authorizations over the past 12 months. I stared at the numbers. The $3,500 dinner bill from the steakhouse, the catalyst that had ignited this entire investigation, was listed at the very bottom. Next to the other line items, that extravagant meal looked like pocket change. It was a rounding error in a sea of massive withdrawals. "The dinner was just a symptom of a much larger disease," Gregory said, tapping his pen against the spreadsheet. "Over the last year, Derek has authorized exactly $842,000 in independent consulting and design fees. All of these payments have been funneled to a single external vendor, a company called Lumina Design." I picked up the spreadsheet. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. In the commercial real estate business, you know the major players. You know, the prestigious architectural firms, the heavy-hitting structural engineering consultants, the elite environmental analysts. I had personally cultivated relationships with the best firms in the city over 4 decades. Lumina Design was a ghost. It did not exist in my world. I asked Gregory to hand me the vendor file. He passed over a thick manila envelope containing the invoices and the master service agreements Derek had signed. I opened the folder and began to read. Building an $800 million real estate empire does not happen by accident. It happens because you learn to read the fine print. In my 30s, I could not afford high-priced corporate lawyers. I spent my evenings sitting at a cheap kitchen table reading municipal zoning codes and construction contracts until my vision blurred. I knew what a legitimate service agreement looked like. I knew the specific ironclad language required to protect a commercial developer from liability. The documents in my hands were an absolute insult to my intelligence. The legal jargon was sloppy amateurish and completely boilerplate. It looked like something a college student had copied and pasted from a free legal website. There were no specific performance metrics. There were no defined delivery dates. The scope of work was incredibly vague, citing general terms like aesthetic consultation, preliminary spatial conceptualization, and ambient interior styling. In the high-stakes world of commercial development, you do not pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for ambient interior styling before the concrete foundation is even poured. You pay for structural blueprints. You pay for load-bearing calculations. You pay for hard, undeniable deliverables. Where are the deliverables, Gregory? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet as I flipped through the pages. If we paid this company over $800,000 in a single year, there must be a mountain of schematics. There should be digital renderings, physical models, comprehensive traffic flow analyses for our new commercial lots. Where is the actual work? Gregory leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. That is the most disturbing part, Harrison. There is no work. I gained temporary access to Derek's digital project management drives. I searched for every file associated with Lumina Design. There are no blueprints. There are no computer-aided design files. There are no site survey reports. The only things that exist in their vendor profile are these incredibly vague invoices, which Derek personally approved and expedited through our accounts payable department every single month. I laid the papers down. The reality of the situation washed over me in a cold, suffocating wave. My son was not just entitled. He was not just arrogant or lazy. He was actively and deliberately stealing from the company I had built from the dirt up. He was siphoning capital that belonged to Blake Holdings Capital that was meant to secure the jobs of my employees and the future of our legacy. He had created a pipeline to drain my life's work. Have you tracked the destination of these funds? I asked, staring at the sloppy signature of my son at the bottom of a fraudulent invoice. Who exactly is receiving these wire transfers? Gregory sighed heavily. I am still tracing the ultimate destination of the capital, but I can tell you right now that Lumina Design is a classic shell company. It was incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago. There is no physical office address, only a registered agent and a post office box. There is no website. There are no other listed clients. The company was created for the sole exclusive purpose of billing Blake Holdings. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the office settle around us. The betrayal was so profound, it felt almost surreal. I thought back to the conversation I had just had with Derek. The feigned exhaustion, the calculated apologies, the promise to make me proud. He had looked me in the eye and promised to be a better son, all while knowing he had bled my company for nearly $1 million. He thought he was untouchable. He believed his position as my sole heir granted him absolute immunity from the rules that governed the rest of the world. I opened my eyes and looked at Gregory. He thought I would never check. He assumed that because I handed him the title of vice president and stepped back from the daily operational grind, the vault was left completely unguarded. Gregory nodded. He relied on your trust, Harrison. It is the most common vulnerability in family-owned enterprises. The perpetrator banks on the fact that a parent will always give their child the benefit of the doubt. They weaponize your love to blind you to the numbers. He underestimated me, I stated firmly. He forgot how this company was built. I did not survive the recession of 1988 by being blind to the numbers. I did not crush the hostile takeover attempt in 2004 by ignoring the details. Every single dollar that moves through Blake Holdings is a dollar I bled for. And no one, not even my own flesh and blood, is going to treat my life's work like a personal slush fund. I picked up the stack of invoices and tapped them against the mahogany desk, aligning the edges perfectly. The anger inside me was no longer a hot, chaotic flame. It had condensed into something freezing and sharp. It was the precise surgical focus of a man preparing to amputate a diseased limb to save the rest of the body. I want to know exactly who owns Lumina Design, Gregory, I said, my voice resonating with absolute authority. I do not care how many corporate veils they have hidden behind. I want their full legal names. I want to know exactly who is actively profiting from this entire deception today. Give me those names, and then we will begin dismantling his life, piece by piece, until there is absolutely nothing left for him to steal from me. Gregory did not hesitate. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a thin manila folder. He slid it across the mahogany desk. The paper was cool, contrasting sharply with the burning heat in my chest. I opened it and stared at a corporate registration document from Delaware. The name at the top, listed as the primary shareholder, was Arthur Pendleton. I looked up at Gregory in absolute confusion. The name meant nothing to me. I knew every major player in the commercial real estate sector, and Arthur Pendleton was not one of them. Gregory anticipated my question. He leaned forward, both of his hands clasped on the desk. He explained that Arthur Pendleton was not an architect, an interior designer, or an environmental consultant. He was a retired car salesman living in a modest condominium in Wilmington. More importantly, Gregory added, his voice dropping to a grim register, Arthur Pendleton was Patricia's first cousin. The revelation hung in the air. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together. My son was not just paying a fraudulent vendor. He was deliberately funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of my capital directly into his mother-in-law's family. Gregory pulled out another sheet of paper detailing the flow of the stolen funds. The money did not stay in Delaware. As soon as Blake Holdings paid Lumina Design for their fictitious interior styling, the funds were immediately wired into an offshore trust account. From that trust, the money was utilized to finance a lavish lifestyle. Gregory read off the expenditures, his tone clinical and detached. There were charges for chartered private jets to the Amalfi Coast. There were invoices for custom diamond jewelry, sports cars, and exorbitant monthly spa memberships. Derek was not just a negligent vice president making administrative errors. He was a systematic thief. He was bleeding the legacy I built to finance the frivolous existence of his wife and her mother. I sat back in my chair, staring blindly at the registration document. For a fleeting moment, a profound sense of paternal grief washed over me. I thought of Derek as a little boy running across the front lawn with a baseball glove, eager to make me proud. I wondered where that boy had gone and how he had mutated into the greedy, entitled man sitting down the hall. But the grief was a momentary weakness. It was quickly consumed by an overwhelming wave of absolute, uncompromising fury. I had not spent 40 years fighting off hostile takeovers, navigating market crashes, and crushing aggressive competitors, just to let my own flesh and blood dismantle my empire from the inside. If Derek wanted to play the role of a corporate predator, I would treat him like one. I picked up the brass telephone sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk. My hand was completely steady. There was no tremor of hesitation. I looked at Gregory, my jaw set in stone. I told him that we were ending this immediately. I instructed him to dial his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I wanted agents walking through the front doors of Blake Holdings within the hour. I wanted Derek handcuffed in the middle of the executive floor, paraded past his colleagues, and thrown into the back of a federal cruiser. I wanted his assets frozen, his bank accounts seized, and a full criminal indictment drafted by the end of the day. He had committed wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. He was going to face the maximum penalty the law would allow. I would not protect him. I would let the justice system crush him entirely. Before my fingers could even punch in the first digit on the keypad, Gregory reached across the desk and firmly placed his hand over the receiver. I looked up at him, my eyes narrowing with intense defensive anger. I demanded to know what he was doing. I told him to let go of the phone. But Gregory did not move. His expression remained incredibly stoic, carrying a heavy, dark weight that I had never seen before in all our years of working together. He gently pressed the receiver back down onto the base, severing the dial tone. He told me to wait. He told me that calling the federal authorities right now for simple corporate embezzlement would be a massive mistake. I stared at him incredulous. I asked him how reporting such a massive theft could possibly be a mistake. Gregory reached back into his leather briefcase. He did not pull out another stack of bank statements or vendor invoices. Instead, he pulled out a single manila envelope sealed with a very thick piece of red tape. He set it down gently in front of me, almost as if he were handling a live explosive. He explained that his cybersecurity team had dug deeper into Derek's private encrypted server late last night. They had bypassed a highly sophisticated firewall looking for more shell companies, but they had found something else entirely. Something that had absolutely nothing to do with real estate architecture or interior design. My heart began to pound, a steady, ominous rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the envelope, broke the red seal, and pulled out a solitary encrypted digital document printed on thick corporate letterhead. Gregory watched me closely, his voice dropping to a quiet, harsh whisper. He told me that the embezzlement we had uncovered was terrible, but it was essentially just the operational funding for a much larger, much more sinister scheme. I unfolded the paper and stared at the bold, black text. It was a wire transfer confirmation. But it was not directed to Lumina Design, nor was it sent to an offshore trust account in the Caribbean. It was a direct, localized wire transfer for exactly $50,000. I looked at the recipient line. It was a private medical practice located in a very exclusive, discreet neighborhood on the Upper East Side of the city. I read the name of the recipient out loud. It belonged to a prominent, highly sought-after private neurologist. A deep, suffocating confusion swirled rapidly in my mind. I asked Gregory why my son would wire $50,000 of stolen capital to a brain specialist. Was Derek sick? Was Monica dealing with a hidden medical crisis? Gregory slowly shook his head, his eyes locking onto mine with a dark, unsettling certainty. He leaned across the desk, his voice barely above a breath, yet it echoed through the silent office like a thunderclap. He told me Derek wasn't sick. He told me they had been monitoring the email exchanges attached to that specific wire transfer. The $50,000 was not a payment for legitimate medical treatment. It was a massive, untraceable bribe. Gregory pointed a steady finger at the neurologist's name on the receipt. He told me that Derek, Monica, and Patricia were actively paying a corrupt medical professional to falsify my personal health records. The room felt devoid of oxygen. The implications slammed into me, staggering all my senses. The embezzlement was just the surface. They were funding a medical conspiracy to destroy my entire life completely. The embezzlement was just the surface. They were funding a medical conspiracy to destroy my entire life completely. The sheer magnitude of Gregory's statement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I stared at the wire transfer receipt, my eyes tracing the ink that spelled out the name of the private neurologist. Dr. Aris Thorne. He was not just any physician. He was a high-profile specialist catering to the city's ultra-wealthy elite, a man known for his airtight discretion and exorbitant retainer fees. I had met him once at a charity gala 5 years ago. He was polished, charismatic, and possessed eyes that evaluated everyone in the room like walking checkbooks. Now my son was funneling $50,000 of stolen corporate funds directly into Thorne's private accounts. I looked across the mahogany desk at Gregory. The seasoned lawyer mirrored my grim expression. We both knew that a sum of that magnitude, secretly wired from a shell company to a doctor without a single corresponding medical appointment on my calendar, was not a consultation fee. It was blood money. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling metropolis I had spent 40 years conquering. The towering skyscrapers of glass and steel usually filled me with a sense of profound accomplishment. Today, they just felt like prison bars. I asked Gregory how we could prove what they were planning. Bank transfers were suspicious, but they were circumstantial. Derek could simply claim he was paying for a private medical consultation for a friend or investing in the doctor's new clinic. We needed the communications. We needed the undeniable proof of their intent. Gregory nodded slowly. He told me that standard corporate auditing had reached its limit. To breach Derek's heavily encrypted personal servers and intercept the communications attached to the Lumina design payments, we needed to step outside the boundaries of conventional legal channels. We needed a shadow operator. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a man simply introduced as Vance arrived in my office through the private executive elevator. Vance was a former federal cybersecurity analyst who now operated exclusively in the lucrative, morally gray sector of corporate espionage. He did not wear a suit. He carried a battered black backpack and possessed an unsettling quiet demeanor. Gregory handed him the digital logs and the IP addresses associated with Derek's hidden server network. Vance did not ask questions. He simply set up his encrypted laptop on my conference table, connected a series of complex routing devices, and began to work. The atmosphere in the office grew impossibly tense. For 6 grueling hours, Gregory and I sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the city skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the room. The only sound was the frantic, rhythmic tapping of Vance's fingers against his keyboard. I poured a glass of water, my mind racing through 1,000 agonizing scenarios. I thought about Monica playing the sweet, devoted daughter-in-law at every holiday dinner, smiling warmly, while secretly plotting my demise. I thought about Patricia lounging in the VIP booth of the steakhouse, sipping expensive champagne purchased with the very money she was using to destroy me. And I thought about Derek, my son. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy I had proudly watched walk across the stage to receive his college diploma. How had his soul become so utterly corrupted? Had my wealth poisoned him? Or had Patricia and Monica simply watered a seed of greed that was already present in his heart? At exactly 9:15 that evening, the rapid typing stopped. Vance leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked at Gregory, then turned his gaze to me. He announced that he had successfully bypassed the secondary firewalls and breached the encrypted email vault Derek used to communicate with Patricia and Dr. Thorne. He had extracted a localized cache of 53 emails and 4 attached PDF documents. Vance mirrored the screen of his laptop to the large presentation monitor on my office wall. The digital evidence illuminated the darkened room with a harsh, glaring white light. Gregory and I stepped closer to the screen, our eyes scanning the chronological list of messages. The subject lines were incredibly innocuous, labeled as architectural consults and estate planning updates. But the actual contents of the messages were devastating. Gregory opened the earliest email exchange dated 3 months prior. It was initiated by Patricia. She was explicitly instructing Derek on how to approach Dr. Thorne with the financial proposition. She wrote that Thorne had a known gambling debt and was desperate for untraceable liquidity. The subsequent emails detailed a chilling, meticulously planned negotiation. Derek offered Thorne $50,000 upfront, funneled through the Lumina Design shell company, with a promise of another $200,000 once the final objective was achieved. And then Vance opened the first of the encrypted PDF attachments. It was a comprehensive medical dossier. My name, my date of birth, and my personal identification numbers were stamped boldly at the top of the first page. I read the diagnostic summary in absolute horror. The document was a flawlessly fabricated psychiatric and neurological evaluation. According to the pages displayed on the screen, I had been suffering from severe, progressively worsening cognitive decline for over a year. The report detailed fictitious episodes of severe memory loss, aggressive behavioral outbursts, and a complete inability to manage complex financial concepts. Dr. Thorne had used his prestigious medical credentials to formally and legally diagnose me with aggressive early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He had falsified brain scan summaries, fabricated cognitive test scores, and signed the document with his official medical seal, legally declaring me entirely unfit to manage my own affairs, my company, or my life. The sheer malice of the conspiracy stole the breath directly from my lungs. The embezzlement was nothing compared to this. They did not just want my money. They wanted to erase my autonomy. They wanted to strip away my humanity and reduce me to a helpless, medically condemned prisoner in my own life. Gregory scrolled down to the most recent email in the chain dated just 2 days ago. It was sent by Monica. She was confirming the final receipt of the fully executed medical documents from Dr. Thorne. Her message was brief, cold, and dripping with triumphant malice. She wrote to Derek and Patricia confirming that the doctor had delivered the final paperwork. She stated that the trap was perfectly set and that they had every reason to celebrate. The final puzzle piece violently locked into place. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I thought back to the steakhouse on my 70th birthday. I remembered the towering seafood platters, the laughter, the clinking of the expensive crystal champagne flutes. They were not celebrating a real estate deal. They were not celebrating a design pitch. They were celebrating the successful completion of the falsified medical documents. They were celebrating the fact that they had just legally purchased my psychological death warrant. While I was sitting alone in my office, assuming my son was working late to protect our family legacy, he was actually raising a glass to my impending destruction. He had smiled, drank my champagne, and called me a clueless old man because he believed he had just successfully bought the power to lock me away forever. A profound, suffocating silence blanketed the office. Even Vance, a man accustomed to the darkest corners of corporate treachery, looked visibly disturbed by the sheer cruelty displayed on the screen. Gregory placed a steady hand on my shoulder. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. He told me we had enough evidence to immediately dispatch the Federal Bureau of Investigation to their homes. We could have Derek, Monica, Patricia, and Dr. Thorne arrested for criminal conspiracy, medical fraud, and grand larceny before midnight. We could end the nightmare right now with a single phone call. I stared at the fraudulent diagnosis bearing my name. The pain of the betrayal was immense, but the tears I expected to fall simply never materialized. Instead, the sorrow evaporated, leaving behind a cold, terrifying, and absolute resolve. I would not call the authorities, not yet. Arresting them now would be far too merciful. It would give them a quick resolution. They had spent months digging a grave for me, and I was going to make absolutely certain that they were the ones who fell into it. I stared at Gregory, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the evil sitting on my mahogany desk. A medical conspiracy. My own son was not just trying to steal my money, he was trying to erase my existence entirely. I asked Gregory to show me the rest of the communications. I needed to see every single word they had written. I needed to understand exactly how deep this rot went into my family. Vance typed a few commands on his keyboard, bringing up a highly organized folder containing dozens of intercepted text messages and encrypted chat logs between Derek, Monica, and Patricia. The messages were displayed chronologically on the large presentation monitor, painting a chilling step-by-step portrait of my own planned demise. Gregory stood up and pointed to a conversation dated 3 weeks ago. It was a group chat led by Patricia. She was the one who first proposed the legal mechanism. She had somehow discovered a specific obscure clause buried deep within the corporate bylaws of Blake Holdings. It was a clause I had personally written 30 years ago to protect the company in the event of a sudden, catastrophic health crisis. It was called the Medical Incapacity Proxy. The clause stipulated that if the chief executive officer was definitively diagnosed with a severe cognitive degenerative disease by a board-certified medical professional, the vice president could legally petition the board of directors for an immediate involuntary transfer of power. I read the messages in absolute disbelief. Derek had responded to Patricia with eager enthusiasm. He wrote that the annual board meeting was scheduled for next week. He explicitly stated that this meeting would be the perfect stage to execute the coup. He planned to stand up in front of the board, play the role of the heartbroken, dutiful son, and present the falsified Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. He would claim that my mind was rapidly deteriorating, that I was no longer fit to manage the $800 million real estate empire I had built from nothing, and that he needed to assume complete control for my own good. He had even drafted a rough version of the speech he planned to give, complete with fake emotional pauses and hollow expressions of paternal love. Monica had chimed into the conversation next, her messages practically vibrating with unchecked greed. She detailed her plans for my office, discussing how she wanted to remodel the executive suite once I was forcibly removed. She talked about liquidating my private stock portfolio and using the capital to purchase a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. She even made jokes about how quickly they could rebrand the company to erase my name from the letterhead. They were dividing the spoils of a war they thought they had already won. They were carving up my legacy like vultures circling a dying animal. But the true horror of their blueprint was not the corporate takeover. The theft of my company was painful, but it was ultimately just a financial loss. The darkest part of their conspiracy was what they planned to do with me physically once the board stripped me of my authority. I asked Vance to open the final thread of messages, a private exchange between Patricia and Derek regarding my immediate living arrangements. My blood ran completely cold as I read Patricia's instructions on the glowing screen. She told Derek that they could not simply force me into retirement and leave me in my own home. She warned him that I was too well connected, too resourceful, and far too dangerous to be left unattended. If I retained access to my personal lawyers, my private bank accounts, or my outside business contacts, I might find a way to challenge the fraudulent diagnosis and fight back. I might demand a second medical opinion. I might expose their entire operation. Patricia had a permanent solution to that problem. She had a close personal associate who operated a private high-security nursing home located 3 hours north of the city, hidden away in a remote suburban county. It was a facility specifically designed for wealthy patients suffering from severe dementia. It was a place where the doors were locked from the outside, where visitation was strictly controlled, and where communication with the outside world was heavily restricted for the supposed safety of the patients. Patricia wrote that once the board voted to enact the proxy, Derek would automatically be granted full medical power of attorney over my life. He would have the absolute legal authority to commit me to that facility against my will. He could sign the paperwork, hire private medical transport, and have me removed from my home in the middle of the night. They were going to lock me away and throw away the key. They planned to sedate me, isolate me, and leave me to rot in a sterile room, while they cannibalized the empire I had sacrificed my entire life to build. I read a message from Derek confirming the plan. He wrote that the nursing home was expensive, but it was a small price to pay to ensure I could never interfere with their lives again. He actually referred to me as a liability that needed to be permanently neutralized. The sheer breathtaking malice of the plan left me momentarily paralyzed in my chair. I realized that the dinner on my 70th birthday was not just a celebration of a forged medical document. It was a victory dinner. They were celebrating the end of my life as a free man. They were toasting to my impending imprisonment. The woman I had welcomed into my family, the mother-in-law I had tolerated for years, and the son I had raised from birth, were actively coordinating my total erasure from society. Gregory watched my face, his expression somber and professional. He asked if I needed to pause. He told me that this kind of psychological trauma was difficult for any man to process. I shook my head slowly, my eyes never leaving the digital text on the monitor. I did not need to pause. I needed to engrave every single word into my memory. I needed to memorize the exact depth of their betrayal, so that when the time came for me to retaliate, I would not feel a single ounce of mercy. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the window again. The city lights sparkled below, oblivious to the monstrous treachery unfolding in my office. I thought about the decades I had spent building my reputation. I thought about the countless nights I had sacrificed to ensure Derek would have a comfortable life. I had given him the world, and in return, he was plotting to throw me into a cage. He wanted to strip me of my wealth, my dignity, and my freedom, destroying my legacy while stealing my entire fortune. I slowly turned back to look at Gregory and Vance. The cold, absolute resolve that had taken root deep in my chest now hardened into an unbreakable diamond. I would finally let them walk directly into a trap of their own making. I turned away from the window and walked slowly back to my chair. The physical sensation in my chest was strange. I expected the crushing weight of a broken heart. I expected the agonizing tears of a father mourning the permanent loss of his only son. But my eyes were completely dry. The profound, breath-stealing betrayal had burned away all the soft paternal instincts I had carefully maintained over the passing decades. In their place, an ancient, deeply familiar coldness settled into my veins. It was the exact same icy detachment I had relied upon during the most vicious corporate wars of my early career. I closed my eyes and allowed my mind to drift back to the early 1990s. Wall Street was a jungle of unchecked ambition, a brutal, unforgiving arena where any perceived weakness was instantly and severely punished. I remembered the ruthless tycoons who had tried to completely dismantle Blake Holdings before it even had a chance to stand on its own feet. I remembered men who were much smarter, much richer, and much more dangerously connected than Derek could ever hope to be. They had actively tried to bleed me dry with hostile takeovers, aggressive short-selling, and predatory litigation designed to ruin my life. I did not survive them by playing fair. I survived them by becoming the absolute apex predator in the room. I learned to anticipate their strikes, lure them into false senses of security, and then dismantle their operations so thoroughly that they never recovered. I had spent the last 15 years playing the role of the benevolent retired patriarch. I had softened my sharp edges for the sake of maintaining family harmony. Derek had grown up under the protective shade of the massive tree I had planted, completely ignorant of the sheer violence it took to properly defend the soil. He mistook my generous nature for pathetic weakness. He mistook my advancing age for creeping senility. If my own flesh and blood genuinely wanted to play a cutthroat game of ultimate survival, I was not going to act like a wounded, helpless victim. I was going to show him exactly how a true, terrifying predator hunts. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Gregory. He was watching me with a complex mixture of genuine concern and professional anticipation. He slowly reached into his tailored coat pocket and pulled out his encrypted cellular phone. He stated clearly that he was going to contact the lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He assured me that with the fabricated medical dossier, the fraudulent consulting invoices, and the offshore wire transfers, the federal authorities would easily have enough probable cause to raid Derek and Monica's estate before dawn. He promised me that they would be sitting in federal custody by breakfast. I reached across the wide expanse of the polished mahogany desk and placed my hand firmly over his. The leather of his phone case was warm, but my grip was entirely devoid of heat. I told him to put the phone away immediately. Gregory frowned, his brow furrowing in deep, visible confusion. He reminded me that Derek and Patricia were actively planning to orchestrate a hostile takeover in less than 7 days. He argued passionately that we had a very narrow window to preempt their malicious strike and legally secure my personal autonomy. He insisted that we needed to strike immediately to properly protect the $800 million empire I had built. I removed my hand and leaned back in my chair, folding my fingers together. I explained my reasoning with slow, deliberate, and icy precision. I told Gregory that if we handed this undeniable evidence over to the federal authorities, right now Derek would undoubtedly hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country using my stolen money. He would drag the complicated legal proceedings out for years. At worst, he would be convicted of white-collar fraud and corporate embezzlement. He might serve 3 or 4 easy years in a minimum security federal facility playing tennis and reading books. Monica would simply file for divorce, secure a massive settlement from his remaining hidden assets, and effortlessly move on to her next wealthy victim. Patricia would distance herself entirely loudly, claiming she was a helpless victim of her son-in-law's terrible manipulation. They would ultimately survive the scandal. A few years in a comfortable federal prison was far too merciful a punishment for the people who had maliciously plotted to steal my freedom and lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward. I did not just want them penalized by the slow justice system. I wanted them utterly systematically dismantled. I wanted to watch them lose every single luxurious comfort they had taken for granted. I wanted them bankrupt, completely destitute, and desperately begging for a mercy they would never receive. I wanted the elite social circles they cherished to aggressively turn their backs on them. I wanted their names to become permanently synonymous with absolute humiliating failure. To achieve that exact level of total destruction, we could not simply react to their pathetic plan. We had to actively encourage it. I looked at Vance, who was quietly packing his decryption equipment into his battered black backpack. I told him that I needed him on a permanent exclusive retainer starting immediately. I instructed him to establish a continuous, undetected surveillance feed on all of Derek's personal devices, Patricia's encrypted channels, and Dr. Thorne's private medical server. I needed to know every single move they made before they even made it. Then I turned my attention back to Gregory. I told him that we were going to initiate a completely different strategy. I called it the senile prey protocol. Gregory leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes sharp with grim curiosity. I explained the intricate mechanics of the trap. We were going to give Derek exactly what he wanted. We were going to let him believe that his flawless deception was working perfectly. For the next 7 days, I would flawlessly play the role of the deteriorating, confused old man he had described in his fraudulent medical file. I would intentionally forget scheduled appointments. I would carelessly misplace important financial documents. I would deliberately show momentary lapses in judgment during casual conversations in the executive suites. We would feed his arrogant delusion, inflating his dangerous confidence to the absolute maximum capacity. We would let him walk into that annual board meeting next week, feeling like an untouchable, conquering king. We would allow him to proudly present the fake Alzheimer diagnosis to my peers. We would let him confidently invoke the medical incapacity proxy in front of the entire executive committee. I wanted him to commit fully legally and highly publicly to his ultimate treason. Because the higher he blindly climbed upon his fragile pedestal of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally shattered the foundation beneath his feet. I would personally ensure that every single board member, every major investor, and every influential figure in this city witnessed his absolute and undeniable public destruction firsthand. The following Monday morning marked the beginning of my performance. I arrived at the executive suite exactly at 8 sharp, wearing a tailored navy suit that felt slightly too large, an intentional choice to make me appear diminished. My secretary, a brilliant woman named Sarah, who had managed my schedule for 2 decades, greeted me with her usual warm smile. I paused at her desk, staring blankly at the polished brass nameplate resting next to her keyboard. I let a long, uncomfortable silence stretch between us, narrowing my eyes as if struggling to grasp a distant memory. I asked her if she had seen the quarterly projections from the Chicago division, deliberately calling her Susan. Sarah blinked, a brief flash of confusion crossing her features, before she gently corrected me and handed over the file. It was a minor slip, completely inconsequential on its own, but in the highly pressurized ecosystem of Blake Holdings, rumors of vulnerability traveled faster than electricity. By noon, I knew Derek would have heard about the lapse. I spent the afternoon actively dismantling my own reputation, for immaculate precision. During a high-level strategy meeting with the regional directors, I sat at the head of the long glass table and stared at the projected revenue charts. When Derek stood up to present his carefully curated numbers for the upcoming fiscal quarter, I interrupted him mid-sentence. I asked him to repeat the operational costs for the third time, feigning a profound inability to follow his simple logic. I rubbed my temples, sighed heavily, and muttered that the numbers simply were not making sense to me today. I watched the other directors exchange nervous, fleeting glances. Derek, however, handled the interruption with masterful, poisonous grace. He walked over to my chair, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, and slowly repeated the figures, using the patronizing tone one might reserve for a confused toddler. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the weary old man, grateful for his son's patience. The trap was not just about public displays of cognitive failure. I needed to create an environment where Derek felt completely comfortable operating in the shadows, secure in the delusion that I was too detached to notice his blatant theft. On Wednesday afternoon, I called him into my private office to discuss a routine vendor contract. Before he arrived, I walked over to the massive steel wall safe hidden behind the oil painting near my desk. I spun the dial, pulled the heavy door open, and deliberately left it ajar, exposing stacks of highly sensitive legal documents and private ledger drives. When Derek knocked and entered, I was sitting at my desk, seemingly engrossed in a completely irrelevant real estate brochure. I watched his eyes dart immediately to the exposed safe. I saw the greedy, predatory gleam illuminate his face for a fraction of a second, before he smoothly masked it behind a polite smile. He sat down, and I handed him the contract, completely ignoring the glaring security breach I had just staged. For the remainder of the week, I meticulously orchestrated a symphony of manufactured senility. I left important, highly confidential emails open on my desktop monitor, while I went to fetch coffee, knowing Derek would inevitably wander in and snoop. I complained loudly to the accounting department about missing funds that I had intentionally misplaced in a different account, only to humbly apologize an hour later for my foolish error. I asked Derek to remind me of the names of our oldest corporate partners during casual hallway conversations. Every single mistake I made was calculated, documented, and carefully fed into the narrative Derek was desperately trying to build. I was giving him all the ammunition he needed to convince the board of directors that my mind was actively unraveling. Vance's continuous surveillance feed confirmed that my performance was working flawlessly. Late Thursday night, I sat in the dim light of my home study reading the intercepted text messages flowing between Derek and Monica. They were absolutely ecstatic. Derek sent a lengthy message detailing my supposed decline, bragging that the stress of the upcoming board meeting was causing my underlying condition to accelerate rapidly. He wrote that he hardly even needed Dr. Thorne's fabricated medical dossier anymore, because I was doing an exceptional job of proving my own incompetence to the entire executive team. Monica responded with a barrage of celebratory remarks, gleefully stating that my pathetic displays were making their hostile takeover practically effortless. They were convinced that my mind was crumbling under the weight of my own legacy, leaving the throne perfectly unguarded. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality of the situation. By Friday, Derek had completely dropped his guard. Emboldened by my apparent deterioration, he began authorizing even larger transfers to Lumina Design, pushing through invoices with reckless, sloppy speed. He stopped covering his digital tracks, assuming that the clueless old man weeping over forgotten names would never bother to check the internal routing logs. He even held a private phone call with Patricia from his office, a conversation Vance easily intercepted, where they openly discussed the exact timeline for moving me to the secure suburban nursing facility. They laughed about how quickly they could pack my belongings, confident that I would be too confused to mount any sort of meaningful resistance. I listened to the recording of that phone call while pouring myself a measure of scotch. The sheer cruelty of their joy was staggering, yet it only served to harden the ice in my veins. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the architect of Blake Holdings, reducing me to a helpless pawn in their grand scheme. But they had failed to realize the fundamental rule of the corporate jungle. A true predator never reveals its strength until the exact moment it strikes. My manufactured weakness was the ultimate weapon, a carefully woven net designed to entangle them in their own boundless greed. As the weekend approached, the stage for the annual board meeting was set perfectly. The board members were flying in from across the country, their minds already primed by the subtle rumors of my failing health that Derek had so diligently planted. The fabricated medical dossier was printed, signed, and ready to be presented as the definitive proof of my demise. Derek had his tragic speech memorized, and Monica was practically measuring my office for new curtains. They were marching blindly toward the precipice, intoxicated by the illusion of absolute victory. And I was standing quietly in the shadows, holding the hammer that would shatter their world into a million jagged pieces. I spent Sunday evening reviewing my final preparations with Gregory and Vance. Every single piece of our evidence was properly secured. Every single legal countermeasure was firmly locked into place. I looked at the two trusted men sitting across from me, knowing that tomorrow morning would fundamentally change my family forever. Derek wanted to treat my business like a ruthless game. Tomorrow he would finally learn exactly what happens when you force a master player back onto the board. He would fall hard, and he would never recover. Monday morning arrived, matching the bleak atmosphere I needed to project. I arrived at the executive suite early to set the physical stage for the grand deception. I instructed Sarah to keep the velvet blinds in my office drawn shut, casting the room in a dim shadow. I loosened my silk tie, unbuttoned my collar, and deliberately rumpled my suit jacket to make my frame appear frail. I placed generic orange prescription bottles on the corner of my mahogany desk, positioned where anyone sitting in the guest chair would immediately notice them. At exactly 10, I pressed the intercom button and asked Sarah to summon the vice president. I infused my voice with a slight waver, a subtle auditory cue of vulnerability. Derek arrived less than 3 minutes later. He knocked softly, pushing the door open, with an expression of manufactured concern he had clearly practiced. He stepped into the office, his eyes locking onto the prescription bottles before scanning my disheveled appearance. A brief flash of predatory satisfaction illuminated his features, though he quickly buried it beneath a mask of dutiful affection. He approached the desk slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. He asked if I was feeling well, noting the office was unusually dark, and I looked incredibly tired. I sighed, a long breath pulling from the bottom of my lungs. I sank deeper into my leather chair, rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. I told him to sit down, stating we needed a very serious conversation about the immediate future of the company and our family. Derek took a seat, leaning forward with an eager intensity he could not conceal. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, fully expecting me to surrender the crown. I looked at him, eyes glassy and unfocused, playing the tragic role of a patriarch, surrendering to the ravages of time. I told him the weekend was difficult, that I spent hours reviewing files and found myself lost in the numbers. I confessed with a calibrated tone of quiet despair that my memory was failing at an alarming rate. I told him I was making mistakes, forgetting details, and the sheer stress of managing the empire was becoming too heavy for my mind to carry. He told me it was natural, I had worked hard enough, and he was entirely ready to carry the weight for me. I pulled my hand back, maintaining the illusion of a fragile old man. I told him I knew he was ready, and that was why I called him into the office today. I opened the top drawer and retrieved a thick, professionally bound portfolio. I slid it across the smooth wood toward him. I explained it was a prospectus for a lucrative commercial development project in the northern suburbs. It was prime real estate zoned for a high-end retail and luxury residential complex. The acquisition cost was exactly $15 million, and the projected return on investment over 5 years was staggering. It was the kind of acquisition Blake Holdings would normally absorb without hesitation. But I told him I did not want the company to hold this asset. I wanted him to hold it. Derek stared at the glossy cover of the portfolio, his eyes widening in shock. He opened the file and began scanning the executive summary, his mind racing to comprehend the scale of the financial opportunity. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a raspy conspiratorial whisper. Son, my mind isn't what it used to be. There's a highly lucrative $15 million suburban commercial land deal. I want you to buy it under your own LLC. Blake Holdings will guarantee the capital. Consider it your early inheritance before I step down. I watched his face closely, tracking every expression as his greed violently collided with his logic. He was a thief, but he was certainly not entirely stupid. He asked why I wanted him to purchase the property under an independent entity instead of integrating it into our existing corporate portfolio. I had the answer perfectly prepared. I smiled a sad, defeated smile. I told him because my cognitive faculties were slipping, I was terrified of making a catastrophic error that could damage the primary company. I explained if he held the asset in a separate limited liability company, it would be shielded from any potential fallout caused by my declining mental state. I assured him Blake Holdings would serve as the financial guarantor for the entire $15 million acquisition loan. He would not have to risk a single penny of his own capital. He would simply sign the purchasing agreements as the proprietor of his new firm, use our corporate backing to secure the credit, and reap the massive profits when the development launched. I framed it as a father trying to protect his son's future from his own inevitable downfall. The bait was golden and entirely irresistible. I could see the greedy calculations firing rapidly behind his eyes. In his twisted mind, he believed he was orchestrating the most profitable week of his entire life. Not only was he planning to remove me from power at the board meeting next week and seize control of my $800 million empire, but now I was handing him an independent $15 million asset on a silver platter. It was a staggering windfall, an unearned fortune that appealed to his parasitic nature. He could use this new LLC to funnel wealth to Monica and Patricia outside the purview of our standard corporate auditors. The temptation overpowered any lingering sense of caution he might have harbored. Derek closed the portfolio, his face flushed with triumphant greed. He looked at me with a sweet smile, thanking me profoundly for my immense generosity. He promised he would handle the acquisition flawlessly, protect the asset, and make me incredibly proud of the man he had become. I nodded slowly, offering a weak smile, telling him to contact his attorneys immediately to begin the incorporation process for his new firm. I instructed him to work with Gregory to draft the formal financial guarantee from Blake Holdings, assuring him my signature would be on the documents by the end of the day. He stood up, clutching the heavy portfolio to his chest like a stolen prize. He floated out of the office, his step light and energetic, secure in the delusion that he had successfully conquered my entire world. I watched the door click shut behind him. The moment the latch engaged the frail facade I had meticulously maintained, instantly vanished. I sat up straight, adjusting my tie and smoothing the lapels of my suit. I reached across the desk and swept the generic prescription bottles into the wastebasket. The trap was now fully set. By accepting the deal and forming the separate corporation, Derek was legally binding himself to a massive financial obligation. He believed my guarantee would protect him completely, unaware I was preparing to sever that exact lifeline at the most catastrophic possible moment. The golden carrot had been completely swallowed whole, and the heavy steel hook was now firmly set deep in his throat, ensuring his absolute and undeniable ultimate destruction forever. Vance's surveillance network was a masterpiece of digital espionage. Less than 20 minutes after Derek left my office, the encrypted audio feeds lit up on the monitor in my private study. Derek was in the back of his chauffeured town car, frantically dialing a conference call to his wife and mother-in-law. I sat back in my chair with a glass of scotch, listening to his breathless excitement. He relayed the entire conversation we just had, painting himself as the brilliant manipulator who had just successfully extracted a $15 million golden ticket from a decaying old fool. He described my feigned confusion with cruel delight, mocking my trembling hands and my supposed inability to comprehend basic corporate strategy. He told them about the suburban commercial land deal, emphasizing that I was willing to let him hold the asset under an independent limited liability company, with Blake Holdings acting as the financial guarantor. Monica squealed with joy, her voice shrill and piercing through the speakers. She immediately began calculating how much the eventual profits would boost their offshore accounts. But Patricia was silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, calculating, and dripping with an insatiable, venomous greed. Patricia told Derek to stop celebrating and start thinking like a true predator. She analyzed my offer with the suspicious mind of a seasoned grifter. She pointed out that if Blake Holdings acted as the formal guarantor for the $15 million loan, the corporate board of directors would inevitably demand a thorough review of the transaction. They would require regular audits of the development, and they would undoubtedly claim a significant percentage of the final profits as a condition of assuming the financial risk. Patricia argued that my senility might be useful, but the rest of the executive committee was still sharp and dangerous. She told Derek that bringing the board into this deal was a massive vulnerability. If any of the senior directors scrutinized the independent company, they might uncover the Lumina Design Shell Corporation. They might discover the embezzled funds. Patricia insisted that they could not risk exposing their entire shadow operation just to secure corporate backing for the land acquisition. She declared that they needed to cut Blake Holdings out of the equation entirely. They needed to seize absolute control of the asset to ensure they kept 100% of the astronomical profits. Derek hesitated, his natural cowardice briefly surfacing. He asked Patricia how they could possibly secure a $15 million commercial real estate loan without the massive weight of Blake Holdings backing the credit. Patricia laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through my study. She told him he was thinking entirely too small. She reminded him of the vast wealth they had already accumulated through their embezzlement scheme. More importantly, she reminded him of the sprawling, ultra-luxury estate he lived in, the magnificent property I had purchased for him in cash on his wedding day. Patricia outlined her brilliant, catastrophic strategy. She instructed Derek to immediately take out a massive high-interest mortgage against his unencumbered mansion to secure the initial liquidity. Then she told him to leverage Lumina Design. Since Lumina Design had been receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent consulting fees from my company every single month, it appeared on paper as a highly successful, cash-rich enterprise. Patricia proposed using their shell company as the primary cross-guarantor for the remaining balance of the $15 million acquisition loan. By combining the equity of the mansion and the fabricated financial strength of Lumina Design, they could secure the commercial funding independently. It was a breathtakingly reckless plan. It was the financial equivalent of building a skyscraper on a foundation of quicksand. If anything went wrong with the suburban development, if the zoning fell through or the market shifted, they would be personally responsible for a staggering, inescapable mountain of high-interest debt. They would lose the mansion, the shell company would be exposed, and they would be utterly ruined. But their arrogance blinded them to the peril. They were completely intoxicated by the prospect of keeping $15 million in real estate equity entirely hidden from my board of directors. Monica cheered the idea, already planning how to spend the exclusive profits. Derek, ever the obedient, predictably greedy puppet, swallowed his mother-in-law's terrible advice without a second thought. He praised Patricia for her genius, entirely convinced that they were outmaneuvering my supposed safety measures and securing their ultimate financial independence. I listened to their triumphant laughter, feeling a profound, chilling satisfaction. I had offered them a rope, and Patricia had eagerly tied it into a noose for all of them. Over the next 48 hours, Vance and Gregory monitored a flurry of frantic, reckless financial activity. Derek moved with a desperate speed, terrified that my fleeting moment of supposed generosity might vanish if my mind deteriorated further. He contacted a predatory private lending firm, the kind of institution that charged astronomical interest rates, but asked very few questions. He rushed through a massive mortgage application, leveraging every single ounce of equity in his luxurious home. Simultaneously, Patricia finalized the paperwork to to bind Lumina Design as the corporate guarantor, submitting their fraudulent bank statements as proof of financial solvency. They were moving so fast, so completely blinded by the scent of unearned millions, that they failed to read the aggressive penalty clauses buried in the fine print of the private loan agreements. By Friday morning, the trap was perfectly primed. Vance intercepted the digital transmission of the final purchasing contracts from the private lenders. I sat at my mahogany desk, watching the live feed as Derek and Patricia logged into the secure portal to execute the documents. They were sitting in Derek's home office, sipping expensive coffee, completely unaware that their every keystroke was being recorded. I watched the cursor move across the screen. I watched Derek apply his digital signature to the primary loan agreement, legally tying his personal estate to the massive commercial debt. A moment later, Patricia applied her signature as the registered agent of Lumina Design, formally binding the shell company to the cross guarantee. The digital stamps locked into place, sealing their fate with absolute binding legal certainty. They had just voluntarily chained themselves to a $15 million anvil entirely of their own free will. I slowly leaned back, a cold smile spreading across my face. The execution was flawless. They had bypassed my corporate protection entirely, choosing instead to risk their own stolen wealth and their personal sanctuary out of pure, unadulterated greed. They thought they secured their kingdom. They thought the board meeting would be a mere formality, a simple crowning ceremony where they would lock away the senile old man and inherit the earth. They had no idea that the ground beneath them had just hollowed out. I called Gregory and told him the signatures were confirmed. I instructed him to prepare the final phase of our operation for Monday morning. The very long game was finally over. It was time to pull the lever and watch them fall straight into the abyss they built. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, bitter chill that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside my private study. I had asked Gregory to meet me at my home long before the sun even breached the city skyline. We needed absolute privacy for this final briefing, far away from the corporate offices and the prying eyes of my son. Gregory arrived at exactly 5 o'clock, carrying the familiar heavy leather briefcase. He looked exhausted, yet there was a distinct, sharp gleam of professional triumph in his eyes. He sat down in the leather armchair across from my desk and accepted the black coffee I poured for him. He did not speak immediately. He simply opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick, official-looking dossier bound in stark red government folders. He placed it gently on the table between us. "It is done," Gregory said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The county registrar officially processed the deeds at midnight. Derek and Patricia are now the sole undisputed legal owners of the suburban commercial parcel. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The liquid was scalding, but I barely felt it. "And the financial structure?" I asked. "I executed exactly as they planned, driven entirely by their own unmitigated greed," Gregory confirmed. "Derek holds the primary deed under his newly formed limited liability company. The purchase was funded entirely by the high-interest private mortgage he took out against his residential estate. Lumina Design. Patricia's fraudulent shell corporation is listed as the primary cross-guarantor. Blake Holdings is completely legally severed from the entire transaction. They explicitly removed our corporate guarantee clauses in their frantic rush to keep the non-existent profits entirely for themselves." I nodded, letting a cold, grim satisfaction settle over me. "Show me the environmental reports, Gregory." Gregory opened the red folder and slid a highly classified, heavily redacted federal document across the table. It was an Environmental Protection Agency geological survey. To the untrained eye, or to an arrogant amateur like my son, the $15 million suburban property looked like an absolute goldmine. It was strategically located near major transit arteries and surrounded by affluent neighborhoods. On the surface, it was the perfect canvas for a luxury retail and residential complex. But Derek had been so blinded by the golden carrot I dangled in front of him, so eager to steal the prize before I supposedly lost my mind, that he never bothered to commission an independent soil analysis. He relied entirely on the outdated superficial survey I had deliberately included in the portfolio, a survey that conveniently omitted the deep history of the land. The property, Grigory began tapping a specific paragraph on the federal document, was home to an unregulated chemical manufacturing plant in the 1950s. Before environmental oversight existed, they dumped thousands of gallons of heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and highly corrosive industrial solvents directly into the ground. Decades ago, the factory was bulldozed and paved over, hiding the poison deep within the soil. I stared at the chemical breakdown listed on the page, and its current federal status. It was quietly classified as a federal Superfund site exactly 3 weeks ago, Gregory replied, a tight, merciless smile touching the corners of his mouth. The federal government has mandated an immediate catastrophic environmental remediation protocol. The toxic plume has begun to migrate toward the local water table. The land is completely unbuildable, entirely toxic, and absolutely worthless. The sheer brilliance of the trap hummed in my veins. A federal Superfund designation is the ultimate nightmare in commercial real estate. It is a financial black hole. The law dictates that whoever holds the legal deed to the property is immediately and unequivocally responsible for the total cost of the government-mandated cleanup, regardless of whether or not they caused the original contamination. What is the current projected cost for the initial phase of the mandated environmental remediation? I asked, already knowing the answer, but wanting to hear the numbers spoken aloud in the quiet of my study. $15 million, Gregory stated with absolute finality. That is just the preliminary estimate to excavate and process the contaminated soil. It does not include the ongoing federal fines, the legal penalties, or the secondary water table decontamination protocols. And because the liability is federally mandated, it cannot be discharged in a standard bankruptcy proceeding. I closed the red folder, running my hand over the smooth paper. Derek thought he had stolen a $15 million asset. In reality, he had just voluntarily purchased a $15 million federal liability. He had mortgaged his beautiful paid-off mansion to buy a poisoned wasteland. And by using Lumina Design as the cross-guarantor, he had legally tied the fraudulent shell company to the massive federal debt. They wanted 100% of the profits. I murmured, the irony tasting sweet and sharp on my tongue. They did not want to share a single dime with the Blake Holdings board of directors. So they manipulated the paperwork, isolated their own companies, and cut us out of the deal completely. In their desperate rush to rob me, they built an impenetrable legal wall that shields my empire from the fallout. They assumed all the risk. Precisely, Gregory confirmed. If you had forced Blake Holdings to guarantee the loan, our company would be liable for the $15 million cleanup. We would be facing an unmitigated disaster. But by playing the fading, senile old man, you convinced Derek that he needed to protect the asset from your supposed incompetence. Patricia's greed did the rest. She manipulated him into using their stolen wealth to secure the property. They built their own financial prison, locked themselves inside, and handed you the only key. The sheer perfection of the poetic justice was staggering. Derek had believed my mind was deteriorating. He thought my casual mistakes and misplaced files were signs of aggressive Alzheimer's disease. He never considered that a man who had spent 4 decades navigating the most treacherous corporate waters in the world might be leading him into a carefully orchestrated ambush. He had looked at the property portfolio and saw a shortcut to unimaginable wealth. He failed to realize that the shortcut led directly off a cliff. What happens when the private lenders realize the collateral they accepted is a toxic Superfund site? I asked, looking out the window, as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. The private lenders will immediately call in the loan, Gregory explained, his tone completely devoid of pity. They will seize Derek's residential estate by the end of the month. They will aggressively liquidate his personal bank accounts to cover the massive deficit. Then the federal government will pursue Lumina Design for the outstanding environmental cleanup costs. When the federal auditors open up Lumina Design's books to seize their assets, they will instantly discover the embezzled funds. The agents will see the fake invoices. They will track the offshore wire transfers to Patricia and Monica. Everything will be laid bare in court. I will let him dig his grave, I concluded. The morning of the annual board meeting arrived with a heavy overcast sky that cast a solemn gray light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blake Holdings executive boardroom. I arrived 45 minutes early, dressed in a suit that looked slightly unkempt, a minor detail designed to reinforce the pathetic illusion I had spent the last week carefully cultivating. I took my usual seat at the head of the massive polished oak table, but I hunched my shoulders forward and let my gaze drift aimlessly toward the far wall. The senior directors began to filter into the room shortly after 9 in the morning. These were men and women I had known for decades, ruthless financial titans, brilliant legal minds, and aggressive real estate developers who had helped me forge this empire from nothing. As they took their respective seats, I could feel their eyes darting toward me with a mixture of quiet pity and sharp, predatory calculation. The rumors Derek had meticulously planted had clearly taken root in their minds. Derek entered the room precisely on time, flanked by his personal legal team, and looking every inch the conquering heir apparent. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit and a perfectly calibrated expression of solemn duty. He paused briefly near my chair, placing a firm, patronizing hand on my shoulder. He asked me in a voice just loud enough for the nearest directors to hear if I was feeling up to the strain of the proceedings today. I did not look up at him. I nodded slowly, keeping my hands folded on the table to hide their absolute, rock-solid steadiness. Derek took his seat at the opposite end of the long table, the traditional position of the executive vice president. The room settled into a heavy, expectant silence. The initial agenda items were handled with a rapid, almost dismissive efficiency. The quarterly financial reports were approved, the standard legal disclosures were acknowledged, and the routine operational updates were filed away. Everyone in that room knew that the true purpose of this gathering was not the standard corporate housekeeping. The air was thick with the undeniable electricity of an impending execution. I sat quietly through the mundane proceedings, occasionally asking a slightly confused question or mispronouncing a familiar term, providing the final necessary brushstrokes to the masterpiece of my perceived decline. At precisely 10:30, the scheduled time for new executive business, Derek stood up from his chair. The entire room fell silent. He did not immediately begin speaking. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath, perfectly mimicking the heavy burden of a man about to perform a terrible but necessary duty. He looked down at the polished wood of the table, allowing a long, dramatic pause to stretch across the silent room. When he finally looked up, his eyes were shining with carefully manufactured moisture. He had clearly spent hours practicing this exact look of heartbroken sincerity in the mirror of the mansion I had purchased for him. He began by speaking about the incredible legacy of Blake Holdings. He spoke eloquently about my decades of relentless dedication, my brilliant strategic vision, and the sacrifices I had supposedly made to build this company into an $800 million powerhouse. His voice was smooth, measured, and layered with a sickeningly sweet, paternal reverence. He told the board that I was not just a chief executive officer to him, but a personal hero, a mentor, and a beloved father. He painted a picture of our family bond that was so thick with fabricated emotion, I almost felt a physical wave of nausea rising in my throat. Then the tone of his voice shifted. The reverence gave way to a heavy, trembling sorrow. He announced to the silent room that sometimes the greatest act of love a son could perform was recognizing when his hero could no longer fight his own battles. He stated that over the past 6 months, he and the family had noticed a severe, heartbreaking decline in my cognitive abilities. He described my intentional memory lapses, my fabricated confusion over basic financial documents, and my supposed inability to track simple corporate strategies. He looked around the room, making direct, mournful eye contact with the most influential directors, assuring them that he had tried everything in his power to hide my deteriorating condition, to protect my dignity. Derek reached into his tailored leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. He broke the seal with a sharp, dramatic tear that echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. He slid the documents out, and placed them on the table. It was the fraudulent medical dossier compiled by Patricia's corrupt associate, Dr. Thorne. Derek announced that he had recently convinced me to undergo a comprehensive, independent neurological evaluation. He stated, his voice cracking with a perfectly timed sob, that the results were absolutely devastating. He instructed his legal counsel to distribute certified copies of the medical file to every single board member sitting at the table. I watched quietly as the thick packets of forged documents were passed down the line. The directors opened the files, their eyes scanning the dense medical terminology, the fabricated brain scan analyses, and the definitive fraudulent diagnosis of rapidly aggressive early-onset Alzheimer's disease. I could hear the soft rustle of pages turning and the low, concerned murmurs rippling through the room. Derek let the devastating information sink into their minds for several long minutes before he spoke again. He wiped a single solitary fake tear from his cheek and squared his shoulders. He declared that the medical evidence was undeniable and that my condition had deteriorated far beyond the point of manageable return. He argued with passionate, aggressive logic that Blake Holdings could not survive with a compromised mind at the helm. He stated that the recent market volatility required sharp, decisive leadership, something the medical report definitively proved I could no longer provide. He played the role of the dutiful corporate protector flawlessly, insisting that he was not seeking power for himself, but rather stepping up to shield his father's magnificent legacy from ruin. He reminded the board of the specific obscure clause buried deep within our corporate bylaws, the medical incapacity proxy. He stated that the foundational documents clearly dictated that in the event of severe medically certified cognitive decline, the board had a fiduciary duty to enact an immediate involuntary transfer of executive power to the active vice president. He looked directly at me, his eyes completely devoid of warmth despite his mournful tone. He told the board that it was time to let the old lion rest. With a final heavy sigh, Derek formally submitted the forged medical dossier into the official corporate record. He then made his final deadly move. Acting as the deeply concerned, loving son doing what was absolutely necessary for his sick father, he formally requested an immediate binding vote. He asked the board of directors to enact the proxy, permanently strip me of all corporate authority, and transfer absolute uncontested executive power of Blake Holdings directly to him. The trap was finally and completely sprung for everyone to clearly witness. The heavy silence following his dramatic plea hung over the boardroom like fog. Directors turned their gazes toward me, their expressions a mixture of pity and hesitation. They waited for my reaction, expecting the confused outburst of a man whose mind was slipping away. Derek remained standing at the far end of the glass table, maintaining his pose of a heartbroken son performing a terrible duty. He looked into my eyes, a silent challenge masked beneath manufactured grief. I did not shout or pound my fists. Instead, I leaned back slowly in my leather chair, letting out a soft chuckle that caused a ripple of confusion to wash over the room. The chuckle grew into a genuine, relaxed smile. I reached under the edge of my desk and pressed a discreet silver button. Instantly, the double doors at the rear of the boardroom swung open with a loud thud. The noise broke the tension in the room. Every head at the table snapped around in alarm. Derek flinched, his perfectly crafted mask slipping as he stared toward the entrance. Gregory walked into the room, his stride calm and projecting absolute authority. My trusted legal counsel was not alone. Flanking him were two individuals whose presence instantly shifted the atmosphere from a corporate dispute to a criminal investigation. They were tall men dressed in dark suits, their badges identifying them as agents of the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were prominently displayed. Behind them, shuffling nervously and looking as though he might collapse at any moment, was a man the board had never met, but whose name was printed on every single medical document sitting in front of them. It was Dr. Thorne, the corrupt neurologist Patricia hired to fabricate my decline. He was a pathetic sight. His face was pale, slick with nervous sweat. He clutched a leather portfolio to his chest like a shield, his eyes darting frantically around the room before fixing on the floor. He refused to look up. A wave of bewildered murmurs erupted from the directors. The chairman of the board stood up, demanding to know the meaning of this interruption. I held up my hand, silencing the room with a simple, authoritative gesture I had not used in weeks. The sudden clarity and absolute command in my voice caused several directors to blink in visible surprise. I calmly addressed the room, thanking Derek for his touching, albeit entirely fictional, performance. I watched my son's face drain of color, the triumphant flush of victory vanishing instantly, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. I gestured toward the trembling physician near the doorway. I informed the board that before they cast any votes regarding my capacity, they needed to hear from the man who supposedly diagnosed me. Gregory stepped forward formally, introducing the federal agents and Dr. Thorne. He explained that Dr. Thorne was present under a specific federally mandated plea agreement. The authorities intercepted communications proving beyond doubt that the medical dossier sitting on the table was a complete forgery. Thorne had accepted a substantial bribe from Lumina Design to falsify records, a severe felony threatening his license and freedom. To avoid the maximum penalty, the doctor agreed to wear a wire during his final meeting with Patricia, providing full testimony regarding the entire conspiracy. The boardroom erupted into stunned chaos. Directors flipped rapidly through the fraudulent medical files. Derek stood frozen at the end of the table, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. The illusion of the dutiful, loving son shattered instantly, revealing the terrified, cornered thief beneath. One of the federal agents stepped forward, his voice a flat professional monotone that cut through the noise. He addressed the board directly, stating that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been monitoring an extensive money laundering and corporate embezzlement ring operating through my son's office. He explained that millions of dollars had been siphoned from Blake Holdings under the guise of fake consulting fees and funneled directly into offshore accounts controlled by Derek and his mother-in-law. The agent turned his gaze toward Derek, whose knuckles were completely white from gripping the table's edge. He announced that the Financial Crimes Division had just executed a coordinated raid on Lumina Design's primary offices and Derek's residential estate. He detailed the incredible financial trap Derek had blindly walked into 3 days prior. He explained to the horrified board that the vice president had used embezzled funds and his personal mansion to secure a $15 million commercial loan for a property he believed would make him independently wealthy. Gregory took over, delivering the final devastating blow with surgical precision. He projected the federal environmental reports onto the large monitor at the front of the room. He explained to the bewildered executives that the property Derek had purchased was a federally designated toxic waste site. He detailed the Superfund status, the massive chemical contamination, and the unyielding legal liability that came with the deed. He made it clear that because Derek had acted out of pure greed, secretly hiding the transaction through his own personal corporation and utilizing Lumina Design as a cross-guarantor, Blake Holdings was entirely shielded from the massive federal cleanup debt. I sat quietly in my chair, watching my son absorb the totality of his destruction. His knees buckled slightly, and he collapsed back into his seat, his eyes wide with a horrified, disbelieving panic. He realized in that agonizing moment that every step he had taken over the past month had been carefully anticipated and orchestrated by the man he thought he was outsmarting. The senile old fool he had mocked behind closed doors had flawlessly maneuvered him into assuming a massive, inescapable, toxic debt, while simultaneously delivering him directly into federal custody. The second federal agent walked slowly down the length of the long glass table. The heavy silence returned, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic sound of the agent's footsteps. He stopped directly behind Derek's chair. He calmly asked my son to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the executive boardroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The board members watched in absolute paralyzed shock as the vice president of Blake Holdings was formally arrested for corporate espionage, felony embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. I stood up from my chair, feeling a sudden weight lift from my shoulders. The tailored suit no longer felt too large. My posture was perfectly straight, my mind sharper than it had been in decades. I looked down at my son, who was weeping pathetic tears as the agents pulled him away from the table. There was no mercy left in my heart, only the cold, satisfying resolution of a battle definitively won. I turned my attention back to the silent, staring board of directors. I calmly adjusted my tie, rested my hands firmly on the polished wood of the table, and informed them that the executive vice president had been officially terminated. It was time to resume the actual business of running my company. The heavy, solid oak doors of the boardroom remained wide open, framing the hallway, where the rest of the executive staff had gathered in stunned silence. I turned my gaze back to Derek, who was still slumped in his chair, trembling uncontrollably as the federal agents stood behind him. I took a deep breath, allowing the full weight of my authority to fill the vast room. My voice, which had been a fragile whisper just moments before, now boomed with the absolute power of a man who had forged an empire from nothing. I told him that the medical report was a pathetic forgery, a desperate illusion concocted by a coward who lacked the intelligence to build his own legacy. But the $15 million toxic debt he had eagerly signed for yesterday, that was very real. I watched the realization wash over his pale face. He had mortgaged his entire life for a poisoned wasteland. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the marble corridor outside. Suddenly, the boardroom doors were violently pushed wider. Patricia and Monica burst into the room, their faces flushed with arrogant triumph. Monica was actually holding a chilled bottle of imported champagne while Patricia clutched a set of crystal flutes. They had been waiting in the executive lobby, fully expecting Derek to text them the moment the board voted to strip me of my power. They had come to celebrate my demise, ready to pop the cork over the grave of my career. They froze the instant they crossed the threshold. The champagne bottle slipped from Monica's manicured hands, crashing onto the polished hardwood floor. The expensive liquid pooled around her designer shoes, a fitting metaphor for their shattered dreams. They stared in absolute horror at the federal agents standing firmly behind Derek, and then at Dr. Thorne, who was weeping quietly in the corner. Patricia's eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for an explanation that did not end in her own destruction. She looked at the board members who stared back at her with unvarnished disgust. She looked at Derek, hoping to find her arrogant puppet, but only saw a broken, weeping child. Finally, her gaze met mine. I did not offer her a single ounce of mercy. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of financial documents. I slammed the heavy folders onto the glass table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. I told Patricia that those files contained every single fraudulent invoice, every hidden offshore wire transfer, and every piece of damning evidence regarding Lumina Design. I explained to the room that for the past year, these two women had been actively conspiring with my son to embezzle $800,000 from Blake Holdings. Monica let out a piercing, hysterical gasp, bringing her hands up to cover her mouth. Patricia stepped backward, shaking her head in frantic denial, insisting that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that Derek had forced them into it. I ignored her pathetic lies. I looked directly at Derek and delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that the predatory private bank had already been notified about the fraudulent cross-guarantees they used to secure the commercial land loan. Because they had deliberately falsified Lumina Design's financial stability, the bank had triggered an immediate default clause. I informed him with cold precision that his luxurious mansion had been officially foreclosed upon this very morning. They were entirely homeless. Furthermore, the federal government was already preparing to seize their remaining assets to cover the $15 million environmental remediation penalty for the toxic waste site. They had assumed absolute personal liability. The magnitude of their ruin finally crashed down upon them with the force of a collapsing building. Derek slid out of his leather chair and fell heavily to his knees right there on the boardroom floor. The arrogant heir apparent, the man who had confidently planned to lock me in a secure psychiatric facility, was now crawling toward my shoes. He reached out with trembling hands, pleading through agonizing sobs. He begged me to reverse the transactions, to use the massive wealth of Blake Holdings, to pay the federal fines, to save his home, to save his wife. He cried out that I was his father, that I had to protect him because he was family. I looked down at him with a detachment so profound, it felt like I was observing a stranger. I told him that he had forfeited the right to call me family the moment he conspired to erase my existence. Patricia began to scream in raw, unfiltered panic. She shrieked that she was a respected member of society, that she could not go to prison, that her reputation would be destroyed. One of the federal agents stepped forward calmly, producing a secondary arrest warrant bearing Patricia's name. He informed her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not concerned with her social standing, only with the $800,000 she had actively helped steal from my corporation. Monica fell back against the wall, sliding down to the floor, as she realized that her life of endless luxury was permanently over. She would be left with nothing but the memory of the wealth she had so greedily tried to steal. The boardroom remained completely silent, every director watching the spectacular collapse of the conspiracy. I stepped away from Derek, ensuring my polished shoes remained perfectly clean. I looked down at the three of them, a pathetic, tangled mess of completely broken ambition and thoroughly exposed malicious treachery. My mind naturally drifted back to the dinner on my 70th birthday, the precise night this entire nightmare truly began. I remembered sitting at the head of my dining table, surrounded by the people I had supported and loved, feeling an invisible wall of deception rising between us. I vividly remembered the cold, dismissive, and arrogant glances they had secretly exchanged when they foolishly thought I was not looking. I remembered how they had hurried through the celebration, eager to return to their plotting, treating my milestone as nothing more than a tedious obligation. I focused my gaze on Derek, who was still weeping into the hardwood floor. My voice was quiet, yet it carried clearly into every corner of the vast room, sharp and unforgiving. I told him that on my birthday, they were all far too busy to simply sit and eat a meal with me. I reminded him of their rush, their fabricated urgency, and their profound disrespect. I paused briefly, intentionally, letting the cold reality of my final words sink completely into his terrified mind. I told him that he would never have to worry about rushing through a meal ever again. I promised him that now he and Patricia would have years of entirely free time in a federal prison cell to sit quietly and eat cafeteria food. I gave a brief nod to the federal agents. The armed agents immediately moved forward simultaneously. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room, permanently finalizing their total, absolute destruction. Monica watched in absolute terror as the federal agents escorted her weeping husband and her screaming mother out of the executive boardroom. She had miraculously managed to keep her signature off the official purchasing documents and the fraudulent corporate shell accounts, shielding herself from immediate federal indictment. However, that legal separation offered her no genuine protection from the crushing reality of her new circumstances. The bank had seized her magnificent estate at dawn. The federal government had already frozen their mutual bank accounts to secure the initial collateral for the $15 million toxic cleanup. She was left entirely destitute. I stood quietly near the head of the glass table and watched my private security team politely but firmly escort her out of the corporate building. She left with absolutely nothing but the designer clothing she was wearing on her back. The boardroom slowly emptied, leaving me standing alone with Gregory. I walked over to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city streets far below. I watched the sleek federal cruisers activate their flashing lights, pulling away from the curb and carrying the remnants of my treacherous family straight toward their ultimate ruin. I felt a profound sense of quiet descend upon the room, a deep stillness that I had not experienced in over a year. I turned my gaze away from the glass and looked directly at Gregory, who was efficiently gathering the remaining legal documents into his leather briefcase. I instructed him to draw up the necessary paperwork to permanently and irrevocably disinherit Derek from my estate. I told him to completely restructure my personal will and the foundational corporate bylaws of Blake Holdings. I wanted my vast shares reallocated directly to the loyal, long-standing employees who had actually bled and sacrificed to help me build this empire from nothing. Furthermore, I directed Gregory to establish a massive, independently managed scholarship foundation. I wanted to dedicate a significant portion of my wealth to funding underprivileged, hungry young entrepreneurs who possessed genuine ambition rather than inherited entitlement. Gregory nodded with deep professional respect, confirming that the new legal directives would be executed flawlessly by the end of the week. I walked back to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, retrieving a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged, exceptionally expensive bourbon. I poured a generous measure into a thick glass, the amber liquid catching the soft light, filtering through the overcast sky. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the familiar warmth radiate through my chest. I was a 70-year-old man, entirely single, standing alone in a massive corporate fortress. I had just permanently lost my only son to an incurable disease called greed. A lesser man might have collapsed under the staggering weight of that heartbreaking reality. A lesser man might have wept for the shattered illusion of a loving family. Yet as I stood there staring out at the breathtaking city skyline I had conquered so many decades ago, I felt absolutely no sorrow. I felt no lingering traces of grief or parental regret. I had surgically excised a malignant spreading cancer from my daily life before it could completely consume my hard-earned legacy. I had protected the sprawling empire I loved, and I had reclaimed total, undeniable sovereignty over my own existence. The air in my office finally felt clean, crisp, and entirely breathable. I took another slow sip of the rich bourbon, savoring the magnificent taste of absolute victory. My grand legacy was finally completely secure, perfectly insulated from the treacherous leeches who had desperately tried to drain it dry. I knew the coming days would bring countless loud whispers across the bustling financial district. But those ignorant whispers meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I proudly emerged sharper, infinitely stronger, and completely victorious against all terrible odds. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and family is never an excuse to tolerate betrayal. We spend our lives sacrificing to provide for our children, hoping they will inherit our ethics along with our wealth. But when greed poisons their hearts, you must have the courage to stop being their safety net. True love sometimes means letting them fall into the terrible consequences of their own devastating actions. Protect your peace, defend your hard-earned legacy, and never allow anyone, no matter who they are, to mistake your fatherly generosity for foolish vulnerability. You owe yourself the respect they denied you. If this story proved that karma always comes back to collect its massive debts, hit that like button to show your support. Please subscribe to the channel for more satisfying stories of absolute justice, and let me know in the comments what you would have done to Derek and Patricia.